So we'll talk about the reptiles and amphibians of the northern Blackland. I didn't want to try to cover the entire Blackland region all the way down to San Antonio, and so I'll talk about the area that we're covering. We have this shot here from Climber Meadow, and boy, don't we wish all of the northern Blackland looked just like that, right? Um, so the the Blackland region on this map here, a lot of you are familiar with this ecoregion map, and the Blackland Prairies are shown in gray. So starting from, we need to, let's see, here we go. Starting around Dallas County and a little bit east of there, and then up toward the Red River, and then down from there. So as you all know, Blackland is referring to this waxy black soil with a lot of clay content that you find in places like around Clymer, and of course there are historical tallgrass prairies in places like Clymer Meadow, Matthews Prairie. There's a nice remnant at Park Hill Prairie that I like as well. But then there's some of the other, like toward the western end around Dallas, there's this Austin Chalk Formation where it's a little different. It's not just the tallgrass prairie, black gumbo. It's instead this kind of ridges and outcrops around Dallas, especially around Dogwood Canyon, some of the places that you all are familiar with. And so that's also technically within the Blackland region, but the habitat's a little different. And of course, there's places with sort of sandy loam and less clay. It's not all black gumbo. And so here's the area that I chose to cover as the northern area. If you look at kind of down toward the bottom, there's Hill and Navarro counties. And I wanted to pick out the stuff that we would see from Hill and Navarro counties northward toward the Red River. What I've done is I've picked out, I used as a reference the series of field guides published by UT Press. The Hibbitzes and other people are involved in that. And I looked at the range maps there to see what animals would we find within that Blackland region. And what I tried to do, because we can't do all of them, I mean, unless you want to be here till 10, we can do that. But otherwise, I had to be selective. And so I tried to pick ones that are of more interest or maybe are more common. And we're going to hit some of those kind of high points of the herps of the Blackland. So reptiles and amphibians are referred to as herps, short for herpetofauna. And in the northern Blackland, that means amphibians like frogs, toads, salamanders, and then reptiles, including alligators, turtles, snakes, and lizards. And the distinction between those are things like this. In reptiles, you have animals with tough skin and scales, with, some of them very scaly, others not so obvious, but pretty tough skin. And then they lay either shelled eggs or they give live birth, is the sort of reptile life history. Whereas amphibians generally start out in water, that is in eggs laid in water. Not every single time, there's some exceptions, but pretty often there's that sort of pattern of you starting out in the water as tadpoles or larvae, growing and then eventually metamorphosing and living on land as salamanders, frogs, toads, that kind of thing. Also, amphibians have warty or slimy skin that absorbs oxygen, and also that skin can secrete toxins. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then the other characteristic that applies to both reptiles and amphibians is that they're cold-blooded, but the better term is ectothermy. Excuse me. So both amphibians and reptiles are ectotherms, and fish are too, whereas mammals and birds are endotherms, that is, they're warm-blooded. And the difference is kind of like this. It's as if endotherms, like reptiles and amphibians, have oh, I'm sorry, endotherms like mammals and birds, us as well. We have a thermostat and a heater built in, so we can tell if it's hot or cold. We sense that, but we also use our metabolism to burn a lot of energy and heat ourselves. Whereas reptiles and amphibians and other ectotherms, they have a thermostat, but they don't have a heater. So a lizard, for example, could tell if it's a sunny day or a cold day, but if it's a cold day, they can't heat themselves up. The thermostat tells them to shift between warmer and cooler spots. So on this morning when it was really cold, if there was a lizard anywhere near the surface, not hidden under rocks and whatever, their thermostat would say, "It's cold, man. You need to wait for the sun, or try to find a place that's warmer to warm up." Um, and then in the middle of the summer, on the other hand, when they're out in the sun and it's 100 degrees, most of our herps are going to say, "Wait, wait, wait! This is like too warm. You need to find shelter. Get in under shade or in crevices and cool down." And the advantage, like, why would you want to be cold blooded? Why would you want to be an ectotherm? And the advantage is that there's a much lower energy requirement. So you're not having to burn all those calories to heat your body. Instead, you use the sun to regulate whether you're about in the right place. So that's the trade-off that they use. Okay, so let's talk about amphibians a little bit. And I wanted to start with salamanders and talk about the typical parts of one. So a this is a typical salamander. They're not all exactly the same, but a typical salamander, like this smallmouth salamander, how is it different from a lizard? Because that's the question that comes up most often. And so the differences include this: the eyes pop up above the head in this salamander. There's no eardrum or ear opening. There's not even a middle ear cavity. There are some inner ear structures, and there's a little bit of hearing, but not much. They have along the body these costal grooves, these kind of folds in the skin. It gives it a little bit more surface area to absorb moisture, and those grooves can even wick up moisture from below so that it can be absorbed into the body. There's four legs, and you see that there's digits on there, but there's no claws on the digits, right? So the toes don't end in claws. And if you look at the tail, it's vertically compressed like an oar. And so most salamanders have that vertically compressed tail like that. So speaking of the smallmouth salamander, let's look at at the smallmouth salamander. Its range includes all the northern Blackland. You don't see them out walking around a whole lot. They prefer bottomland forests and nearby wetlands. They live around ponds, and they stay in burrows and under fallen logs and things like that. They eat things like earthworms and arthropods. They breed around this time of year, January to February, on rainy nights. We haven't had a lot of those, right? But that's when they breed. What happens is um, males deposit a spermatophore, kind of a packet of sperm, which the female then picks up into her body. So it's sort of like not exactly external fertilization, but not exactly internal either. And then later on, the female will lay these fertilized eggs in shallow temporary wetlands. And then they'll go through the larval stage and eventually emerge to be salamanders. Here's one of the other salamanders in the area. This is the eastern newt. And This one is found in kind of the northern parts of the northern Blackland, up toward the Red River. Again, they really like forest and savanna habitat. They love bottomlands. They breed from the autumn through the spring, and they are really you. They seem like a very confused sort of salamander, right? Like they don't really know what they want to be, right? Their life history is a little different. They start out as eggs laid in the water. They hatch into larvae, um, and then typically they emerge as terrestrial efts. That stage is called an eft, and it's a land-dwelling critter. It's sometimes called a red eft because a lot of them can be red. The one you're seeing there is not, it's mostly green. And they live in land for maybe a few years. And then they come back to the water. It's like, well, no, wait a minute. I think I want to be aquatic again. So they become an aquatic adult that have with lungs, but they live in water. And then some of them are even more confused. There are some that just go straight from the larval form into a gilled adult living in water. So they're pretty confused, but they're really cool critters that you see occasionally, especially around bottomland forests and wetlands like that. And the other salamanders of the northern Blackland include stuff like the eastern tiger salamander, the marbled salamander, which is the top photo there, and the dwarf salamander you can see, and then the lesser siren. So those are the other salamanders you see. So let's talk about frogs and toads for a minute. Again, a typical frog might look a little bit like this green frog, and some of them have a dorsolateral ridge. You see that there with the arrow pointing to it. That's glandular tissue. It helps secrete some toxins. Behind the eye, you see the tympanum or the eardrum. And in some of them, like this one and like the bullfrog, the size of the eardrum helps you tell whether it's male or female. Since this one's no bigger than the eye, this marks this frog as a female. If it's bigger, then it would be a male. And frogs typically have these long back legs, feet strongly webbed. They're really adapted for long leaps and for swimming in the water. So that's kind of a typical frog. Whereas the typical toad, like this Woodhouse's toad, has, let's start with the cranial crests up at the top. So on the top of the head, you see, and it's a little hard to see in this toad, there's sort of raised bony ridges called cranial crests. And the shape and size of them may help you tell which toad you're looking at. The tympanum is there just like with the frog. There's behind the eye, a big kind of raised area called a parotoid gland. And that is also something that's involved in secreting toxins. And each of those warts along the back also secretes toxin. So like if a dog picks it up, it's this sort of milky white looking stuff that will make the dog salivate and foam at the mouth and drop the toad. Basically helps them survive a predator that might want to eat them. There are a few things, including some of the snakes, a couple of the snakes, that will eat toads and do okay, but their skin secretions are kind of toxic. Not enough for us to worry about them. They don't cause warts like in the old wives' tale, and they also it's not enough to be a medical concern for us. But if you handle a toad and wipe your eyes, it's probably going to burn. And then they have short back legs for hopping rather than long leaps. So here's how they reproduce. When in a few weeks, you're going to start hearing some frog calls out there, and those are what we refer to as an advertising call, and that is that those are males, those are the guys calling out the females to say, and particularly after rains and when temporary ponds fill up, and basically saying, hey, it's time to mate, or time to lay eggs and create some more frogs here. Different species have different calls, so it's kind of like with birds. If you are trained in them, you can listen to the call and say, okay, that's a Woodhouse's toad, or that's a gray tree frog, or whatever. So the female approaches, the male mounts and holds on in a kind of a piggyback kind of position called amplexus. And then so when the female releases eggs into the water, the males release sperm at the same time and fertilize the eggs in an external kind of fashion. Some of the frogs lay a bunch of eggs, maybe in the hundreds, and a few species even could be in the thousands. And here's what an egg mass, well, this is an egg mass that's just hatched. What's in the photo here is in clear water, so it looks, don't mistake it, it's not laid out in the air, it's underwater. And it's a bunch of these little jelly-like globes that have, in this photo, have just hatched into little embryonic tadpoles. Those are going to be tadpoles, and they'll grow and grow and look maybe something like this one. And as they keep growing, they have leg buds at the back of the body. If you can see by the arrow, that tadpole that's on its back, you can see a leg developing there. They keep on developing, and the front legs develop and pop out of the skin and get to this point where it's almost now a cricket frog. The tail will be absorbed and it'll finish developing, and it'll be a land-dwelling frog. By the way, thanks to Megan for all these photos. I've used a lot of her photos because they're fantastic. Speaking of cricket frogs, here are a couple of cricket frogs. These are really common. They're very small. And the reason there's two side by side is that the one on the left is from the LBJ grasslands where the soil is lighter, kind of caliche. And so the frog population tends to wind up looking kind of like the substrate. They're a little bit lighter. The one on the right, that photo was taken in the big thicket where with bottomland area with very dark soil, and the frogs themselves look very dark. So let's see. Let me show you what the call sounds like before we move on. This is what cricket frogs sound like when they're calling.
Northern cricket frog, Acris crepitans.
Sounds kind of like two rocks being knocked together, doesn't it? That's what cricket frogs sound like as they're calling. So, and if you're curious, I'll go into this later. That basically, some of these reptiles and amphibians have really a kind of a crazy story about their nomenclature right now, right? So it's Eastern cricket frog in some field guides, Blanchard's cricket frog in iNaturalist, same frog, different name, and we'll go into that if you're curious. So they live around wetlands. They're active year round. On a sunny, fairly warm winter day, you can see them out. It's a little frog, and they don't live long. Their average lifespan is anywhere from 4 months to about 16. In other words, about a year and a half. So they don't live very long, and they tend to be fairly common. Okay, next frog. This one I'll do a little bit more quickly. You will occasionally see gray tree frogs. There's two kinds. They are almost impossible to tell by looking at them. The three photos you see here are just three gray tree frogs in different coloration. They can change color a little bit. I don't know if these are the gray tree frog as in Hyla versicolor, or if they're the Cope's gray tree frog, which is Hyla chrysoceles. The main difference is that they have different sets of chromosomes. So one has the usual pairs of chromosomes, the other has 4. And their calls are somewhat different, but otherwise they're very hard to tell apart just by looking at them. So here's what Hyla versicolor, one of the gray tree frogs,
Gray
like.
tree frog, Hyla versicolor.
So it's kind of bird-like, right? It's a kind of a flute-like trill. It's a really pretty trill. Whereas Cope's gray tree frog,
Cope's gray tree frog,
that's not as
Hyla
nice.
chrysoceles.
Yeah. That's not nearly as musical. Let's see. And then this is the green tree frog. And it's one of our most beautiful frogs. Again, more like in ponds and lakes and bottomlands, but you might see them around prairies, at least in wetland areas around prairies and in riparian corridors. A neat frog. And the green tree frog call sounds almost a little bit like a weird duck.
Green tree frog, Hyla cinerea.
So, and in the background, you heard another frog, but weird quacking sound is the green tree frog. Okay, let's talk about narrowmouth toads for a moment. There's two species, both of them are found in the northern Blackland. There's the Great Plains narrowmouth toad and the eastern. I'm more familiar with the Great Plains, and out on the prairie, if you hear in the spring, if you hear a Great Plains narrowmouth toad in a roadside ditch calling, it sounds like a wasp that's really annoyed. So, or maybe a mosquito. Nah, sorry, I'm having some difficulty with.
Great Plains narrowmouth toad.
All right, one more time.
Great Plains narrowmouth toad. Gastrofrine olivacea.
So you can kind of come up with your own analogy of what it sounds like, but some sort of insect is kind of the idea. It's quite a weird call, and it's loud. So if you're standing there at night by the roadside ditch, it's a pretty loud call. Both of them are found in the Blackland, as I mentioned. They're little frogs, and that's the other thing is that the nomenclature is kind of weird about what's a frog, what's a toad. And there's some where it's very obvious. This one is not so obvious. It's probably more like a frog. It has a kind of a smooth, almost slimy skin. It has a little narrow head, and there's a fold of skin at the back of the head. If you notice on that photo, behind the eyes, there's a fold of skin. That'll help you identify them. Also, if it just looks like the head is way too small for the body, it may be a narrowmouth toad. They're very secretive. They're nocturnal. And the story is that Great Plains narrowmouth toads sometimes live in a mutualism with tarantulas. So they may both live in the burrow. And the story is that the Great Plains narrowmouth toad may eat little ants that may get in and annoy the tarantula or interfere with egg laying. And of course, the tarantula provides a certain amount of protection for the Great Plains narrowmouth toad. So that's a kind of a mutualistic relationship. That's a pretty cool story. Quite a place to live, right? All right, really quickly, this is a spotted chorus frog. These are also small frogs, about the size of a cricket frog, and it's a prairie animal, but they stay underground most of the year. Here's the sound.
Spotted chorus frog. Pseudacris clarkii.
Almost sounds more like what you would expect a frog to sound like, right? It's kind of like running your thumb over the teeth of a comb. And they're found through a good bit of the northern Blackland. And here we go. They stay underground in dry weather, but they come out in spring or late winter after rains and breed in roadside ditches and small ponds and temporary pools. A really cool frog. This is the American bullfrog. This is one pattern. I'll show you another one in a sec. And here's some info about those. This is our biggest frog, up to 8 inches long. They're found really all over the state. Usually they're near water. They eat basically anything that can fit in its mouth. They're really aggressive feeders. The call, which I'll show you in a minute, I don't get the jug of rum thing. It's really, to me, more like a snore or a hum, or like really like a big truck passing you on the highway. There's a kind of, I'll show you in a sec. They also have a squeak or a squawk when they're alarmed. If you scare them and they jump in the water, sometimes you hear this kind of squeal from a bullfrog. They are invasive in parts of the US. They've been moved around all over the place for frog legs and sometimes get loose or are released where they may outcompete local frogs, and it can be a real problem. They're also a carrier of chytrid fungus, and there's probably not time to go into chytrid, but if you have questions at the end, it's basically a fungal infection that's really harming a lot of frog populations. These frogs often survive chytrid but carry it. Here should be the call.
Bullfrog. Rana catesbiana.
That's the bullfrog. The other kind of larger frog, these are smaller than bullfrogs, but the other kind of largish frog that we have is the southern leopard frog. And it's a spotted frog with the two big dorsolateral folds down the back. They live around ponds, lakes, wetlands, and this is what they sound like at night. It's almost like a chuckling, and then there's this almost like two balloons being rubbed together. Let me show you.
Southern leopard frog, Rana sphenocephala.
Kind of a variable call, right? But sort of like chuckling and then like balloons being rubbed together. So let's talk about toads for just a second. This is the Gulf Coast toad. This is probably our most common toad. And here is what it sounds like.
Coastal plain toad, Bufo nebulifer.
You notice that a lot of our frogs have a kind of a short call that's repeated, and toads often have a longer extended call. That's what Gulf Coast toads sound like. They have very prominent cranial crests. So if you look at this beautiful photo from Megan, you see that these raised bony ridges are very, very noticeable in Gulf Coast toads. Really helps identify them. They're found from Dallas County southward in the Blackland. They're very adaptable. They do well in urban settings, and they are adaptable enough that they seem to be, at least in some places, maybe replacing some of our other toads. There are places where we used to find Woodhouse's toad commonly where they've kind of disappeared and been replaced by Gulf Coast toads. And the other frogs and toads of the northern Blackland include all this list here, right? Including Strecker's chorus frog, which is the picture on the top, and the pickerel frog on the bottom there, and a bunch of other really cool frogs that I wish we had time for, but we got to move on. So let's talk about reptiles for a little bit. Let's start with the American alligator. Here's a photo of a pretty big gator, but beside a canal. And alligators, yeah, here we go. Alligators are really well adapted to living in water. They have a palatal valve, so at the back of the throat, if you look at a gator with its mouth open, there's a flap at the back that will close off the mouth so that underwater, a gator can open its mouth and not, have problems with water going down into its lungs. They have valved nostrils, and even the ears can squeeze shut so that it doesn't get water in them. They have a nictitating membrane, which is a clear extra eyelid that will close off, and they can see underwater without actually getting the eye exposed to junk underwater. They're found in much of the northern Blackland, but of course that doesn't mean you're not going to find one hanging out on the Gilgai at Clymer, but they really need rivers, lakes, or pretty large wetlands. But in those river systems, including within the Blackland, if they have a big enough wetland, you might find a gator. They really need muddy banks and bottoms. They dig holes for overwintering and for when things dry up. The size is typically about 6 to 13. That's not a record length. They can get longer than 13, but most gators are going to be 6 to 13 feet, and the males are a little bigger than the females. Now, that last thing there is really to warn everyone. I don't think you guys would do this, but people sometimes feed alligators out in the wild, and that is a real problem. And so some places, some preserves, you'll find signs posted that says a fed gator is a dead gator. And what that means is that alligators are usually shy and they'll stay away from you. But if you feed them, they'll lose their fear of people and they'll approach people. And that's when things can turn dangerous. And they often become nuisance gators that have to be trapped and removed. So don't feed alligators, please. Don't let anybody, don't encourage other people to feed alligators. That is a bad deal. All right, let's talk about turtles for a minute. So there's 4 major groups of turtles in North Texas, including snapping turtles, mud and musk turtles, soft shell turtles, um, and pond turtles, including the box turtles. All of them have shells. The upper shell is called the carapace. The lower shell is called the plastron. Now, what you see in the photo is an alligator snapping turtle's skeletal upper shell, the carapace. Those are the bones of the carapace. You kind of can see where the ribs are, and then there's these other bones that fill in to give that dome, across there. Now, a turtle's shell in life is covered with scutes, either with skin or with scutes that are sort of like fingernail, and there's living tissue under there. So turtle shells are sensitive. So for example, if somebody tried to carve something into a turtle shell, that would hurt like the dickens. Turtle shells are pretty sensitive. So how does the neck work? And this example here from one of my books shows that one group of turtles, and the ones that we find in North America, all of them in North America are going to be in this group, and they're called cryptodires. The neck bends in a kind of an S shape, right? The head retracts back in because the neck bends in that way. In the rest of the world, um, the head may bend to the side. Those are called pleurodires, or a lot of those turtles are called side neck turtles. So here's here's a photo of the snapping turtle that was in the diagram there. This is the common snapping turtle, not the alligator snapping turtle. It's a great big old honking turtle. This photo was taken after I just moved this turtle. The turtle was really annoyed. I moved it off the road. They do travel sometimes, and I moved it off so it wouldn't get run over. They're found throughout the Blackland, again, in creeks and ponds and that sort of thing, that can travel overland between different wetlands or to lay eggs. And when they're out of the water, they readily bite. They don't usually underwater, like I wouldn't worry about wading in a pond. They're going to just try to get away from you. But when they're out of the water and more vulnerable, they will readily bite. They have a long neck and they snap really fast. So you have to be really careful with snapping turtles. They can really hurt you. They have a very varied diet. They'll eat dead stuff, invertebrates, fish, frogs, birds, pretty much anything they can get hold of. The lovely photo by Megan up at the top there is a common snapper cruising around underwater. That's neat to watch. They're really kind of graceful underwater, and they're kind of ungainly, when they're on dry land. Here's another group of turtles. These are the mud and musk turtles. They're small, stinky little guys. This particular one that I'm holding here is called a stink pot. They have musk glands that, they really stink. So I ain't kidding you. They live in ditches and stock tanks and that kind of thing, and eat carrion and crustaceans and insects and stuff like that. So here's our commonest turtle. This is a red-eared slider. This is what they typically look like. You can see they've got the kind of yellowish stripes on the head and neck and the red patch behind the eye. And they're very common. They're found throughout the Blackland and throughout most of Texas, and in fact, throughout much of the world. The pet trade and the food trade has moved these turtles everywhere. And there are places in Asia, in Europe, where they've been released or gotten away, and they outcompete some of the local turtles. So that's a real problem. They live in ponds, creeks, rivers, lakes. They eat lots of everything. Older ones, especially older males, can look like this one in the inset photo here. They get very dark. You can't really see the red patch anymore. They're called melanistic, or it's a melanism issue where the dark pigment takes over and they don't have much pattern anymore. Females get bigger than males, and males have long foreclaws that they use in courtship. So here's a three-toed box turtle. And do I have a soft spot in my heart for box turtles? And I could talk with you all night about them. I will restrain myself, but they really are cool turtles, and they're in a lot of trouble. Part of the reason that I tend to talk about them a lot. This is the three-toed species. We also have ornates. The confusing thing in references that you see in field guides and other places, in some of the Texas Parks and Wildlife stuff, you'll see them referred to as eastern box turtles, which is really confusing for those of us who grew up looking at field guides and knowing that there was a really pretty eastern form that doesn't look anything like this to me. And that's biologists who really just stop at species and don't really mess with subspecies will sometimes call them eastern box turtles. But the least confusing term is the three-toed box turtle. And the SSAR, which is the Society for Study of Amphibians and Reptiles, still calls it a subspecies, Terrapene carolina triungus, and that's what I'm sticking with, and I call it a three-toed box turtle. They're found throughout the Blackland. They like open woodlands, meadows, floodplains. They're omnivorous. They used to be affected a lot by the pet trade. That's outlawed. I mean, people are not supposed to pick them up out of the wild anymore. But they have a life history that makes them really vulnerable to things like either being collected or being run over on the highways. And that, of course, is still going on. And that is really resulting in a decline in their numbers. So this is a softshell turtle, and I couldn't resist using Megan's lovely photo here of this smooth softshell. There are a few in the Blackland, but they barely get into the Blackland region. But the smooth softshell looks almost the same as a spiny softshell. There's a few differences, but this is the best photo that I could find that shows that odd snorkel-like nose and that flat, soft, kind of rubbery shell, and the webbed feet. The turtle looks like it's flying in the air, doesn't it? They're really neat turtles. So here's the other turtles found in the northern Blackland, including the chicken turtle that's on the top there, and the ornate box turtle found in the bottom, and all the different the other varieties that are illustrated or that are listed there. So let's talk about lizards for a minute. In the Blackland, we've got animals like the one over on the right here, skinks, race runners and whiptails, legless lizards, spiny lizards, earless lizards, and historically the Texas horned lizard, which I'll mention a little bit, but you're not going to find them anymore, not in the Blackland. So let's start by talking about this broad-headed skink and talk about how kind of the parts of the typical one. Some of the skinks and also the legless lizard can be confused with snakes, right? How are they different? And the way they're different from snakes is that the jaws are rigid and fused in the front, as you can see in this one. They have eyelids so they can close their eyes. They have ear openings. Most species do. Most species have four legs, and those legs end in claws. The digits end in claws. The tail often can break off in some species at any rate, can break off. So if a predator grabs them, they can get away, and they may be able to regenerate that tail. This is the green anole. A lot of you have seen these lizards. They are common in East Texas in the woodland and forest. They're pretty arboreal, so that means they want to be up off the ground. You might see them in the Blackland region, in prairie kinds of stuff, maybe in tall grasses, or in riparian corridors, in brush and trees along wetlands. And this is a kind of a spiny lizard, but I don't mean a Texas spiny lizard. So let's talk about what people refer to as fence lizards. Really, what we have in Texas is called the prairie lizard. I know that all sounds really confusing, right? That's because the name situation with a lot of our reptiles and amphibians is kind of crazy. But this is a lizard that loves to live in trees. The one on the left is a male, and you can see there's not as much pattern on the back. The one on the right is a young lizard that's probably a female, and that's what the females look like, with all those black areas and different pattern elements. In the inset photo, you see what a male looks like, especially in breeding season. If you turn it upside down, those blue patches are a typical male pattern. They're really beautiful lizards. And here's another photo of a fence lizard or a prairie lizard. As you can tell, they look a lot like a Texas spiny lizard, but they're smaller. The one in my hand here is an adult, and the scales are smaller, so it's not as prickly looking as a Texas spiny, but the pattern is very similar. And so, speaking of Texas spiny lizards, let's talk about the difference between a Texas spiny lizard and a Texas horned lizard, because sometimes people will see a spiny lizard and they'll think they've seen a horned lizard because they're so spiky. But here's the difference. The Texas horned lizard has two horns at the back of the head, and you see the photo at the top is a Texas horned lizard. Two horns at the back of the head. They have a kind of flat, broad body and a very short tail. And they don't climb. They skitter around on the ground, and again, they're pretty much eradicated from the Blackland. But a Texas spiny lizard doesn't have horns at the back of the head. They do have spines, but no horns. They have a long tail. They don't have a flattened body. They have a kind of a long body, and they readily climb. That's their MO. They basically, their job is to climb up in trees and ambush insects. Okay, other lizards of the northern Blackland include this list here, including the Mediterranean gecko, which you see a photo of on the top right, and the spotted whiptails and the race runner, or the prairie lizard, which is the bottom right. And that is probably, as far as I'm concerned, it's one of our most beautiful reptiles in the whole state, I think. Okay, let's talk about snakes. I know I'm zipping along, but I know we're going to run out of time, so I've got to run through the snakes really quick. We have these groups of snakes in Texas, from blind snakes to a really large group called colubrids that include most of our harmless snakes, then the pit vipers and the elapids, which is the coral snake. So the typical snake, let's look on the left at the broad-banded water snake. What you're seeing is the underneath of the body down toward the tail. So you have broad ventral scales that cross over the body. You have the anal scale that covers the vent. And then the tail, the scales of the tail are usually in two rows. As you see on this water snake, there's two rows of paired scales. So the pit vipers have a single row, and there's the long-nosed snake, which you're not going to see in our area, has a single row. So to some extent, it helps you tell apart venomous from non. That's not like the preferred way, right? Most of our harmless snakes have a double row of scales under the tail. On the top of the body, you have the unblinking eye. This is a Great Plains rat snake with the eyes are protected by a clear scale, so they can't close their eyes and they don't blink. The scales on the top of the body, the dorsal scales, are sometimes smooth, like in basically this snake, or they may be keeled. They may have a ridge down it and look rougher. The tail doesn't usually break off. If they're held by the tail and they twist, it will break off, but it will not regrow. And they don't break that easily. So that's what a typical snake, what some of the parts are. We got to talk about jaws for a second, because people have this idea that the snake's jaws unhinge. I mean, they've got to eat prey with no hands or arms. So how are they going to do that? The mouth has got to open really wide. And the way they do that is, first of all, the quadrate bone, that's indicated by the Q there. It's like an extra bone that extends the jaw back and extends the reach of the jaw. They can open bigger. And also the jaws don't connect except by a ligament in the front. The bottom jaws there can spread far apart. And that's how they eat really big prey. They don't become unhinged. So here's our commonest bigger snake at any rate. And this is the what used to be called the Texas rat snake, now called the Western rat snake. The pattern's kind of variable. You see this sort of gray or blue-gray pattern on the left, and then a more yellow pattern on the right. There's just a lot of variability, but they all look kind of like this, with a plain gray head and blotches down the back. And here's what the young ones look like. There's a lot more pattern on the head. They're not plain gray, and the pattern's a little brighter. That's what the babies look like. And this one here is doing what Texas rat snakes really know how to do. It's gaping and showing us its mouth. You can see, you get kind of an anatomy lesson, right? The double row of inner teeth on the palate, the upper jaw, those are called palatine teeth. So they really have 4 rows of teeth on the top. That's weird, huh? And on the bottom, you can see the glottis, the windpipe, comes right to almost to the front of the mouth. It comes pretty far forward, and it's open. He's getting a breath of air. And you can see where the tongue slides down into that sheath in the floor of the mouth. Now the snake's gaping, but these are really not mean snakes. what they are is they're very defensive snakes. They get scared easily, and if you if you corner them or pick them up, they are quick to bite. Otherwise, don't worry about Texas rat snakes. They're harmless, and they will just get away if you let them. They really like to climb trees. They are found in prairies and savannas sometimes. They're pretty big. They get up to maybe 6 feet long. They eat a lot of rodents, and occasionally they'll eat birds if they're available. So that's the Texas rat snake. Here's the western ribbon snake. This is a beautiful, graceful, wonderful snake that you'll see along ponds and creeks, and you could see them in prairies near wetlands. And the deal about ribbon snakes is um, they largely eat frogs and maybe baby toads. They only eat a few fish, but you find them along the edges of ponds, gobbling up like cricket frogs and young leopard frogs and stuff like that. They are related to garter snakes, but here's a garter snake. This is a kind of a blackland animal. They're not just on the blackland, but this is a lot of these snakes where they're found in the blackland, and they are in trouble. This is the Texas garter snake, and they look kind of like ribbon snakes, don't they? There's a little bit more pattern in the back. Now this snake, this little guy is trying to scare me off, so he's puffed up his body. They're not usually quite so fat, and the little colors between the scales are not usually as obvious. But what I'll want you to notice is it has a broad orange stripe down the back, and the scales along the lips, there's little black markings at the edges of those scales. That's one way to tell them from a ribbon snake, is those black edges along the lip scales. Okay, got to move on. Here's one of our commonest water snakes. These get kind of big and chunky. This is a plain-bellied water snake. As they get big, they can be almost plain brown. They live around water sources, and they're often confused with cottonmouth. Now, if you notice along the lips of the snake, first of all, you notice they have big, kind of goggly, round eyes, and they have dark edges along the lip scales, and that's one of the ways that you can identify the snake. The babies, as you can see in this little photo from Megan, are more brightly colored, and they have kind of pink on the sides between the dark bands. So they like swamps, marshes, bottomlands, but you can also find them in ponds and creeks. They like frogs and toads, but they'll also eat some fish. They're often confused with cottonmouths, and they're pretty cold tolerant, so you can see them out on winter days pretty easily. Here's one of our other snakes, and this is definitely a blackland animal. This is a prairie king snake. Prairie king snakes are kind of secretive. You see them at night some. Much of the time they spend in burrows under covers. You don't see them very often. This is the eastern yellow-bellied racer. These are very fast, moderate-sized snakes. The babies are spotted like you see in the inset. They're really quick and graceful. And so far we've been talking about non-venomous, harmless snakes. Let's talk about the venomous snakes really quick. This slide talks about what the venom is for, and it illustrates the venom apparatus. You can see in the diagram, there's the venom gland. In a typical pit viper, the venom gland is kind of in the back of the jaw, behind the eye. There's a duct that leads to the fang. The fangs can rotate down for biting, and the duct carries the venom to the fang that works like a hypodermic needle. With coral snakes, which we'll get to, they grab and hang on, and the venom kills prey. Pit vipers, like this one on the right, often will bite, inject, and then they may release, like if it's a rat, for example, will release it, and then they can track down the prey. The venom is already beginning the process of digestion inside the animal as it kills it, and then the snake can track it down and eat it. And obviously, venom is also used in defense, but its primary use is really in subduing prey. So this animal right here, I mean, I couldn't do this talk without talking about the western diamondback rattlesnake, but they barely get into the Blackland area. They basically get in around Dallas, around that Austin chalk formation that I was talking about, in the ridges and all around maybe Cedar Hill or some of those areas. You identify these guys by those two diagonal stripes on the face, the diamond sort of shaped pattern, and then on the tail, the black and white bands. That's typical western diamondback stuff. This is our other bigger rattlesnake from the Blacklands. This is a timber rattlesnake, or what used to be called a canebrake rattlesnake. These guys like uh, river bottomland stuff, and kind of tracking the rivers. So they're not going to be out on the go guy, not be like literally in a tallgrass prairie, unless it's pretty close to some water, probably like the Trinity or something. There's another fairly big rattlesnake. They're pretty easy going, but the venom is a big deal. You really don't want to be bitten by one of these rattlesnakes. So I've got a quick thing about the rattle. They're basically a series of interlocking dry segments. And when the tail shakes, it sounds like a buzzing sound. The tail shaker muscles are really specialized, and they can shake them at over 60 cycles per second. That's really fast. If you try to do that with your finger, I bet you can't get anywhere near 60 cycles per second, right? That's really fast. So here's our other pit vipers, the northern cottonmouth. I in the last 20 years, I've gotten a lot of experience with cottonmouths. I was worried, like a lot of people, about their bad reputation as being really aggressive. I found them to be almost the least aggressive of our pit vipers. They'll basically usually leave you alone if you leave them alone. That's what they look like. Very keeled scales, look very rough, pretty dark looking snake, but guess what? The young ones look like this, very reddish, almost look like a copperhead, right? That's what a baby cottonmouth looks like. They darken with age. And what you see here is one that's gaping. So if you notice, the mouth is open, but the fangs are not rotated down, right? This is a common habit these snakes have to try to scare you away. That snake is bluffing me. And when I took this photo, the snake sat there and gaped at us and didn't do anything else, never approached me, never tried to bite. In fact, I had to get something out of the car because I didn't expect to see snakes and I didn't have a snake hook. I had to like improvise something to push that snake off the road so it wouldn't get run over. That's how non-aggressive it was. It was just sitting there telling me, hey, dude, get away. Leave me alone with this threat display here. And if you want a scientific paper to back up this idea that they don't chase you and they're basically usually not aggressive, not always, of course, don't do anything silly, but usually not aggressive. There's this paper that I've got on the slide here by Gibbons and Dorcas, where they put that to the test and found, yep, sure enough, they're usually not very aggressive. Again, it doesn't mean to do anything silly. It just means don't be like unusually afraid of cottonmouths. All right, cottonmouths are related to copperheads, and this is an eastern copperhead. They have a kind of an hourglass type pattern across the back, um, and are found more toward the east. This is the other species or subspecies of copperhead called the broad-banded copperhead. You can see the bands on this snake are kind of irregular, but they're broader. They don't form an hourglass kind of pattern. A lot of what you might find in the Blacklands might be kind of an intergrade, a little bit of both. They have a reputation for being pretty easygoing, and it's true, they're not very aggressive. But again, the bite is a medical emergency. You don't want to play around with copperheads. And most people are bitten when they go out walking at night barefoot and step on one. So here's our coral snake. This is the Texas coral snake. You can see there's red and black and yellow bands. But up in the corner, you see that rhyme. Don't. I'm going to encourage you to leave that rhyme alone. Don't do it. Because the red and yellow kill a fella, or red and black, red on black, poison black, the pattern can be a little bit different. And this coral snake you see has got a lot of black in those red bands, right? Sometimes the black almost overtakes the red bands, and it's really hard to tell, wait a minute, where's the red? Also, if the snake is on the move, it is just so hard to look at those bands and say, wait, what touches what? Here's the answer. Just leave them alone. These are really non-aggressive, secretive snakes that will burrow out of sight or get the heck away from you if you let them go, and you probably won't see them again. It is potentially a dangerous snake, but they're very non-aggressive, and unless you pick them up or touch them, you're very unlikely to be bitten. So don't worry about the rhyme. Take a photo if you can, but don't pick them up or get too close, and just let them go away. So here's some safety stuff about venomous snakes. Um, you want to watch where you step and put your hands. You remember what I was saying about people that get bitten walking barefoot at night. Um, you don't want to physically interact with venomous snakes uh, unless you've got specific training and mentoring. So don't just read a book or look at a YouTube video. You really need to be taught how to do it safely. Um, and you can observe and photograph from a distance. Now, 8 to 10 feet is a general guideline. I don't want you to say, okay, well, I think it's 8. And, like I don't want you to get too close. But what I want you to know is that since the snakes won't chase you, if you're a decent distance away, you can take a photo or watch if you have secure footing and if you can move further away if needed. Because sometimes the snake takes off where it thinks shelter is, and it just kind of stupid about that, and it may come toward you, but it's not chasing you, but it's just not being smart about where to go. If it comes toward you, just step out of the way and it'll be okay. So don't feel like you have to run for the hills if you ever see a venomous snake. If you're far enough back, just take photos, enjoy it, and all that. My suggestion is not to kill the snake because that puts you more at risk. You've got to get close to the snake. The snake gets freaked out. It's on the defensive. You are more likely to get bitten if you try to kill the snake. And also, if you get rid of the one venomous snake, it creates a vacancy for another one to move in. So it's better just to not try to kill the snake. And it's not just because I love them. It's really because I think that puts you at risk. If you want more information about North Texas venomous snakes, both how they live, identifying them, all that, see my website, the Lives in Nature website. There's a page for nature, I think is what it is. If you look at that URL there, you go to that one, there's PDF articles you can download that'll give you more info about that. Okay. Other snakes of the northern blackland include all of those, including that wonderful little rough green snake that you see in the picture there, and a number of others that I wish we had time to talk about. But we're really kind of done. So let's see if you have questions that you want to ask. I will, and I will go, hang on. So there's the 2 books that I have, in case you're interested in looking at any of those. And we can talk about any questions you have.